So I went to the last resort and contacted Ferrari. I just need a bit of advice with this 296. But because this car hasn't been repaired by Ferrari, they couldn't work on it.
Unfortunately, until the 296 has been to a body shop, we can't have it on site, just because Ferrari is so strict.
For months, Ferrari gave Mat Armstrong the same answer. No parts, no service, no help. He had bought a wrecked 296 GTB out of Cyprus, sunk over $23,000 into a new hybrid battery, trying to fix it himself.
Here is my Ferrari 296. And this is the hybrid battery out of it. And we think the reason why this car don't start is something to do with this in the hybrid battery.
And still the car would not start. Every request to the factory came back closed, the same wall he had already hit once before with Bugatti. Then, without any public explanation, Ferrari reversed course, but only on one tightly controlled condition. What technicians eventually found once they got access made the entire standoff feel almost absurd. The wreck, the refusal, the reversal, the reveal. Let's break down exactly how this played out. The Ferrari that refused to come back. Mat Armstrong has built an entire audience around a very specific kind of project, buying cars other people had given up on, and forcing them back to life on camera, one impossible repair at a time. There was the totaled Porsche GT3 RS he rebuilt well enough to race other supercars. There was the Aston Martin DBX he picked up for almost nothing because it had been fully submerged underwater, its electronics soaked beyond what most shops would even attempt to save. And there was the Bugatti Chiron, arguably his most famous rebuild, a project that eventually put him in direct contact with one of the most exclusive manufacturers on the planet, and turned a private repair job into a public standoff. So when a heavily damaged Ferrari 296 GTB turned up in Cyprus, wrecked badly enough that most buyers would have walked away, the instinct was not surprising. Buy it, strip it down, rebuild it, and document every step for an audience that had already watched him pull off exactly this kind of recovery before. What made this project different became clear almost immediately. The car simply would not start. No amount of new parts, no combination of diagnostics run from the garage, produced anything more than warning lights and silence. Armstrong suspected the crash had damaged the hybrid battery internally, a reasonable theory given how central that battery is to a modern hybrid supercar's ability to even wake up, let alone drive. So he did what he had done on previous builds, trusting the same instinct that had worked before. He spent the money to fix it properly, sourcing a replacement hybrid battery at a cost north of $23,000, a sum that would make most car projects unviable on its own, let alone one already burdened by the price of the wrecked donor car itself. It did not work. The car still refused to start, still refused to charge, and began throwing new warnings that had not appeared before, including an alert for battery thermal runaway.
Battery thermal runaway, danger, danger. The ignition's come on. This is the first time we've ever had the ignition on.
So it is doing more.
But I can't turn the ignition off.
Alongside several temperature sensor faults, the kind of cascading error messages that suggest a system confused about its own condition rather than a single clean fault. Progress, if it could be called that, came in fragments. The hazard lights eventually stopped flashing erratically. At one point, the ignition actually came on for the first time in the build, a small victory that briefly suggested the worst might be behind him. But full operation never arrived. Each small win produced another dead end, and Armstrong found himself exactly where he had started, only considerably poorer and considerably more confused. What he had not yet realized was that the mechanical side of the problem, however frustrating, was about to become the smaller of his two obstacles. There is a particular kind of confidence that comes from having done something difficult before. And it is exactly that confidence that makes the next failure sting more than it should. Armstrong had walked into flooded electronics before, and won. He had walked into a totaled chassis before, and won. A hybrid battery that would not charge looked, on paper, like a problem within the same family, solvable with enough money and enough patience. What made the Ferrari different was not the mechanical complexity of the fault itself, but the fact that solving it would require permission he did not yet know he was going to need. Buying a wrecked exotic out of Cyprus is itself not a simple transaction. Salvage titles on cars at this level move through a narrow, specialized market, often through insurance auctions or private brokers who deal almost exclusively in accident-damaged high-value vehicles. And the paperwork alone can take weeks before a car is even cleared to ship. By the time the 296 GTB reached Armstrong's workshop, he had already cleared that first hurdle, confident it would be the hardest part of the process. His audience, built up across years of exactly these kinds of recoveries, had watched him clear similar hurdles before, and had little reason to expect this one would be any different. That confidence is worth remembering, because it makes the wall he was about to hit land with more weight than it might have for someone attempting a rebuild like this for the first time. The question Ferrari couldn't avoid. Modern hybrid supercars are not repaired the way older cars are repaired. A skilled, independent mechanic with the right tools can often diagnose a mechanical fault without much trouble. But the electronics governing a car, like the 296 GTB, are locked behind manufacturer authorization, tied to the vehicle's specific identification number, and largely inaccessible to anyone operating outside Ferrari's official network. That single detail, the VIN itself acting as a kind of gatekeeper, is worth sitting with for a moment. It means a car is not simply a physical object once it leaves the factory. It is also a database entry, and a manufacturer can, in practice, decide how much of its own knowledge and its own components that entry is still allowed to access. Armstrong ran directly into that wall. When he attempted to order genuine 296 challenge parts to assist with the rebuild, Ferrari blocked the sale outright. The challenge designation matters here, because those are not ordinary replacement components. They come from Ferrari's own factory-built race variant of the 296 stripped-down, track-focused hardware that the company treats as closely as it treats the car's core intellectual property, generally reserved for customers running officially sanctioned one-make racing programs rather than independent rebuild projects assembled in a private workshop. He had also previously tried to purchase components built specifically for Ferrari's own GT3 race program, hoping they might help bridge gaps in the rebuild, and that channel was closed to him as well, one restriction stacked on top of another. Factory policy, it turned out, prohibited a crash-damaged car from even being brought on site for diagnostics until the existing repair work had been inspected and formally signed off by a Ferrari-approved body shop, a requirement Armstrong's independent, garage-based rebuild had no path to satisfy. Is that policy protective or obstructive? The honest answer is probably both at once, depending on which side of the counter someone is standing on. From Ferrari's perspective, a car rebuilt outside its authorized procedures, with components that may not match the vehicle's original specification, represents a liability the company has no way to verify or stand behind, especially on a platform where a hybrid system carries real electrical risk if handled incorrectly. From Armstrong's perspective, he owned the car outright, had already sunk enormous money into fixing it responsibly, and was simply asking for access to components and expertise he was willing to pay full price for. This was not, notably, Armstrong's first encounter with this exact dynamic. His Bugatti Chiron rebuild had followed an almost identical script. Bugatti had refused to sell official parts, or support an independent rebuild conducted outside its authorized network, effectively blacklisting the car's identification number and making genuine components nearly impossible to source through normal channels. That earlier standoff had drawn enough public attention that Bugatti Rimac's own chief executive, Mat Armstrong, addressed it directly, explaining that independent repairs on a hypercar of that complexity carried real safety risks and that the car ideally belonged back at the manufacturer's own facility in France.
And they have to split the car in half. You can't do that in a garage. There's just a few places in the world with the right equipment and only a few people in the world with the right training to be able to do that.
The parallel was not lost on anyone watching Armstrong's Ferrari saga unfold. Twice now, a manufacturer had looked at his rebuild and decided the safest answer was simply to withhold help entirely, leaving him to either solve an impossible problem alone or wait for a change of heart that might never come. There is a pattern worth noticing across both standoffs, one that says less about Armstrong specifically and more about how the entire hypercar segment now treats ownership once a car leaves the showroom floor. A generation ago, buying a car meant buying a machine. Full stop, something a determined owner could eventually understand well enough to fix without anyone's blessing. A modern hybrid hypercar is closer to a partnership, one where the manufacturer retains meaningful, ongoing control over what the owner is actually permitted to do with the thing they purchased outright. Whether that arrangement is fair is a question with no easy answer, and it is one that will likely only become more pointed as more of these cars age out of warranty and into the hands of exactly the kind of independent, camera-documented rebuilders that Armstrong represents. It also raises a question few buyers consider at the moment of purchase, when the excitement of acquiring a car like this tends to outweigh the fine print. Does paying 7 figures for a hypercar include the right to fix it however its owner sees fit? Or does it come with an invisible asterisk, one that only becomes visible the moment something goes seriously wrong and the manufacturer decides how much help, if any, that owner has earned? When every fix failed. With the factory door closed, Armstrong kept working the only angle available to him, treating the problem as purely mechanical, and hoping persistence would eventually uncover what expensive parts had not. The $23,000 battery replacement had been the obvious first move, and its failure left him with a difficult realization. If the most likely, most expensive component swap had changed nothing, the fault was hiding somewhere he could not easily see, buried inside a control system he had no authorized way to access. The car sat in that state for an extended stretch, cycling through small, teasing signs of life that never resolved into anything usable. Hazard lights that had blinked randomly finally settled down. The ignition, dead for so long, briefly came on. Neither development moved the car any closer to actually running. Meanwhile, the warnings kept accumulating. Thermal runaway alerts and sensor faults stacking up on a dashboard that seemed to be diagnosing a dozen problems at once, without pointing clearly at any single one. Each new code sent Armstrong back to forums and specialist contacts, chasing theories that sounded plausible until they, too, failed to explain the silence coming from under the hood. Independent hybrid specialists, even the rare few willing to look at a car this exotic, kept running into the same ceiling Armstrong had: diagnostic software that required manufacturer-level credentials just to read past the surface-level fault codes, let alone clear them. It is one thing to lack a part. It is another thing entirely to lack the software handshake required to even understand what is broken. And by this stage of the rebuild, Armstrong was running into both at once. A mechanical puzzle wrapped inside a permissions problem, each layer making the other harder to solve. What does a person do when the most obvious, most expensive fix fails completely? Most owners at that point either give up or hand the car to a specialist and absorb whatever it costs. But Armstrong had already tried the specialist route and been turned away. This is where a project like this typically ends for most owners. Not with a dramatic failure, but with a slow, expensive stalemate. Money spent without answers. Time invested without progress. A car sitting half-finished in a workshop while its owner runs out of ideas. It is worth pausing on just how unusual it is for a functioning business built entirely around solving hard problems to run completely out of road. Armstrong's channel exists because difficult rebuilds resolve, because the audience gets to watch a wreck become a working car again. A project that simply stalls, indefinitely, with no clear next step, threatens something more than one car's value. It threatens the entire premise of the content built around it. Armstrong had already exhausted the direct approach once, having previously attempted to purchase parts specifically built for Ferrari's own GT3 race program to aid the rebuild, only to have that channel blocked as well. Every route back to the manufacturer's expertise kept arriving at the same closed sign. With his own diagnostic options running out, and the financial cost of guessing climbing higher with each attempt, Armstrong made the decision that had, at least in the Bugatti chapter of his story, eventually worked before. He wrote directly to Ferrari, one more time, framing it later as his last real card to play. He had little reason to expect a different answer than the one he had already received, and every previous message had ended the same way, but the alternative was leaving a finished, drivable car permanently parked as a monument to how far stubbornness alone could carry a project.
It looks bad boy. It's not finished, of course. It's not finished. But it looks so sick.
Before running into a wall no amount of money could dissolve. The moment Ferrari finally said yes. For a company that had spent months saying no, Ferrari's eventual response arrived without any public explanation for the change. There was no statement addressing the earlier refusals, no acknowledgement of the blocked parts or the months of silence, simply a decision to finally engage. But engagement came with a condition specific enough to suggest the company had thought carefully about exactly how far it was willing to bend. Ferrari agreed to inspect the car, but only once the rebuild had been completed independently and brought to a finished state, meaning Armstrong still had to solve the underlying problem, largely on his own, before the factory would even open the door to look at it. It was less an olive branch than a narrow, carefully bounded exception, help offered only after the hardest part of the work was already done. There is something almost bureaucratic about the precision of that condition, a company drawing a line specific enough to protect itself from setting a broader precedent while still allowing this one particular case to move forward. It suggests less a change of heart and more a carefully negotiated exception, arrived at only after enough time had passed for both sides to understand exactly what the other was willing to accept. There is a version of this story where Ferrari simply never responds at all, where the car sits unfinished, indefinitely, and the saga ends not with a resolution, but with a shrug. One more expensive lesson about the limits of independent ownership. That version was entirely plausible right up until it was not. What tipped the balance likely was not any single factor, but the accumulation of all of them at once. The mounting public visibility, the demonstrated seriousness of Armstrong's investment, and perhaps simple institutional fatigue at watching a story about a stonewalled customer continue to circulate with no end in sight. Why extend that exception at all, after so firmly refusing it for months? Ferrari has not said publicly, and speculation fills that gap in different directions depending on who is telling the story. Some read it as the company recognizing the growing public attention around the rebuild, an audience of millions watching a manufacturer refuse a paying customer in real time, and preferring engagement over an increasingly visible standoff playing out across social media and automotive press coverage. Others see it more simply, a manufacturer occasionally willing to make a narrow accommodation once a persistent customer has demonstrated enough commitment, enough documented spending, and enough patience to be worth the exception, regardless of who happens to be filming. Both explanations can coexist without contradicting each other, and neither one requires Ferrari to have acted out of anything more complicated than practical calculation. There is also a simpler commercial reality worth naming. Armstrong's audience numbers in the millions, and a story about a major manufacturer stonewalling a paying customer over months, told entirely from the customer's side of the counter, is not a narrative any luxury brand particularly wants circulating unanswered. Whatever the internal reasoning, the practical result was the same. Once the car finally arrived at an official Ferrari dealership under those terms, technicians who had access to Armstrong never had begun working through the problem methodically, starting exactly where he had started months earlier, with the hybrid battery.
To the point where I had to order a whole new hybrid battery. Inside here is one Ferrari battery, and if this is the reason why this car won't start...
The problem was never the battery. The technicians began, as Armstrong himself had, by focusing on the hybrid battery, the same component he had already replaced at enormous expense. For months, it had refused to charge properly. What they found instead was almost anticlimactic, given everything it had taken to get there. The real cause was not the battery at all. It was the electronic parking brake, disengaged during the original accident to allow the wrecked car to be moved, and never re-engaged afterward because the vehicle lacked the power to do so. On the 296 GTB, the hybrid system requires the parking brake to be actively engaged before it will allow the battery to recharge at all, a deliberate safety feature meant to prevent a car plugged in and charging from rolling away unexpectedly. In other words, the expensive battery replacement had likely never been necessary in the first place, a possibility hard for anyone to sit with after already writing that check. Even once that fix was applied, the car still refused to start, which meant the investigation was not over. Technicians moved on to the control modules and wiring harnesses, spending several more days before finding the second piece of the puzzle. On the 296, the touch-sensitive start and stop control is built directly into the steering wheel itself, a detail easy to overlook until it becomes the entire problem. Armstrong had already installed a steering wheel salvaged from another wrecked car earlier in the rebuild, and that component turned out to be incompatible with the system it needed to trigger, a mismatch invisible to the eye, but decisive underneath. Only once technicians tried a different, properly matched wheel did the ignition finally behave the way it was supposed to. How much of this saga could have been avoided with authorized access from the very beginning? A diagnostic scan and a parking brake check instead of months of blocked parts, a $23,000 battery, and a public standoff. That is the real lesson sitting underneath this story. Less about one stubborn car, and more about what ownership means once a vehicle's most basic functions are locked behind a manufacturer's permission. This did not happen in isolation. Independent mechanics and right-to-repair advocates have raised a version of this same concern for years, arguing that as cars become rolling computers, the person who paid for the vehicle increasingly needs the manufacturer's cooperation just to keep it running. A wrecked hypercar in a Cypriot workshop is an extreme example of that dynamic, but the underlying tension is the same one playing out in ordinary driveways, just without the cameras or the audience watching every setback. Somewhere between the parking brake and the steering wheel sits the actual shape of modern car ownership. Less a single villain and more a system of small, cascading permissions, each one reasonable alone, until an owner tries to string enough of them together to simply start his own car. A company built its reputation on precision and exclusivity. and protected both, even when it looked indistinguishable from refusing to help. An owner built his reputation on persistence, and that persistence eventually worked, though not before costing him money. A single phone call, answered months earlier, might have saved entirely. In the end, the fix was not a battery. It was not even a complicated one. It was a parking brake, and then a steering wheel. Two small details standing behind months of blocked parts, thousands of dollars, and a very public standoff. Ferrari was not wrong to protect what it built. Armstrong was not wrong to fight for what he owned. Somewhere in that tension is the real story of what it means to own a modern supercar. Once its most basic functions answer to a manufacturer first and an owner second. If this story pulled you in, leave a like, drop a comment with what you think Ferrari's real reasoning was, and subscribe for the next chapter in this saga.